Okay, so you know how much we love getting into those questions that really make you think, right? The stuff that gets at those core beliefs that we've maybe held for a long time.
Yeah.
And suddenly you're like, wait a minute, why do I think this way? Where did this even come from?
Yeah, exactly. Those aha moments are the best.
Right.
Those like foundational shifts.
Totally.
I mean, it can be kind of like,
Unsettling.
yeah, a little unsettling.
Yeah.
But also so exciting because it opens up like a whole new way of seeing things.
Totally. And the material that you sent us for this episode is like a prime example of that.
Yeah.
It's going right to the heart of something that so many people think they know, the story of the virgin birth of Jesus.
I mean, that's like Christmas 101, right?
Right.
Everybody knows that story.
Yeah. We sing about it.
Yeah.
We act it out in those little nativity plays.
Right.
It's like all the creeds.
Yeah.
It's this fundamental bedrock belief for so many people.
Yeah.
And so we're going to do a deep dive into this because what you sent us, it doesn't just accept that traditional story. It actually pushes back on it.
It really does.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. So our mission today is to look at the evidence, the historical evidence, the textual evidence around the virgin birth story.
Absolutely.
And we're going to lay out the different interpretations that people have about it.
Right.
The arguments for and against, so that you, the listener, can come to your own informed conclusion about what you think about all this.
I love that word informed.
Yeah.
Because it really is about like empowering people with the information to make their own decisions.
Right. To figure out where they stand on all of this.
Exactly.
Okay. So when we talk about the virgin birth, the common understanding, the traditional view is that it's a miracle.
Yeah.
Right. It's this unique event that points to Jesus's divine nature.
Absolutely. So it's seen as like proof that he wasn't just a man, but that he was God in human form.
And that's where the material you've shared kind of throws down the gauntlet a little bit.
It really does. Yeah.
And says, okay, what if Jesus was fundamentally human,
Yeah.
filled with the Spirit of God, but not God himself?
Right.
Incarnate.
It asks the question, like, if that's who Jesus was, then how does the virgin birth fit in?
Right.
Or does it even fit in at all?
And this material is not afraid to ask some pretty tough questions about whether this story that we think we know so well maybe has been misunderstood or even manipulated over time.
Right. And to me, that's what makes this so exciting to really dig into.
Totally. Okay, so let's start with the Bible itself.
Okay.
Because, you know, a lot of people just assume that the virgin birth is like this consistent thread throughout the whole New Testament.
Right.
But here's the thing that your material points out.
Yeah.
Only 2 of the 4 Gospels actually mention it.
Exactly. Matthew and Luke.
Matthew and Luke.
And even then, their stories don't exactly line up perfectly.
Right. So even within those 2 accounts, there are some differences.
There are definitely some discrepancies.
In the details, right?
Yes. And you know what else is interesting?
What's that?
The silence.
The silence of...
The other gospel writers.
Oh, right.
Mark, who a lot of scholars think wrote the first gospel.
Yeah.
He doesn't mention a virgin birth at all.
Doesn't mention it.
And John, whose gospel is like super theological.
Yeah.
I mean, he goes deep into Jesus's divine nature.
Right.
But he doesn't say anything about a virgin birth.
So interesting.
And then there's Paul.
Oh, yeah.
Whose letters actually predate the Gospels.
Yeah.
And he lays out a lot of the core Christian beliefs.
Right.
But he never mentions a virgin birth. Never.
Not once.
That's pretty wild.
Right.
Yeah.
It makes you think about what was really important to those early Christians.
Totally. Okay, so then the material you sent goes on to talk about the genealogies in Matthew and Luke, which are these really detailed family trees.
It's super detailed, going all the way back to King David, tracing Jesus's ancestry.
And here's the thing.
Yeah.
They both trace it through Joseph.
Through Joseph.
The guy who supposedly wasn't his biological father.
Right.
So it's like, wait a minute, was Joseph considered Jesus's father in some way, even if not biologically?
Or was Jesus not really descended from David?
Right.
Like, it creates this tension.
It does.
That's hard to reconcile.
Yeah. And it gets even more complicated when you start looking at the Old Testament prophecy.
Right, because those prophecies about the coming Messiah, they consistently emphasize his lineage from David.
Absolutely. It's like a key theme.
Right. So why would the gospel writers go to all this trouble to establish Jesus's Davidic ancestry through Joseph?
Right.
If the virgin birth already made him like super special.
Exactly. It's like they're trying to have it both ways.
Yeah. It's really interesting.
And speaking of Old Testament prophecies,
yeah,
let's talk about the big one.
Right.
The one that everybody uses to support the virgin birth.
Isaiah 7.14.
Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son.
Sounds pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah. On the surface, it does.
Yeah.
But your material points out something super important about the original Hebrew.
Okay.
So the word that's translated as virgin in that verse, it's the Hebrew word alma, which actually just means young woman.
Oh, wow.
Not specifically a virgin.
So there's a difference there.
There's a huge difference.
Okay.
The Hebrew word for a woman who's never had sex is Bethula.
Okay.
And Isaiah didn't use that word.
Didn't use it.
So it's like the whole foundation of that prophecy is built on this potential mistranslation.
Well, how did it happen?
Well, when the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek in the Septuagint, which was the version that was widely used at the time, Alma was translated as Parthenos.
Parthenos.
Which can mean virgin, but it can also just mean young woman. So it's like the subtle shift in language opened the door for a whole new interpretation.
A prophecy about a young woman giving birth suddenly became a prophecy about a miraculous virgin birth.
Exactly, and it's a huge difference.
Huge.
And it's important to remember the historical context of that prophecy, too.
Right, because it wasn't some far-off prediction about the Messiah.
No, Isaiah was talking to King Ahaz, who was facing a very real and present political crisis.
Oh, so it was about something that was happening right then.
Right then.
Okay.
He was assuring Ahaz that God would deliver him.
Yeah.
And the birth of a child was a sign of that deliverance.
That makes a lot of sense.
So the sources you shared are saying that that prophecy probably had a fulfillment in Isaiah's own time.
So a baby was born to a young woman.
Right.
And that was the sign.
Yeah.
Okay, and so but then the material talks about this concept of telescoping in prophecy.
Yeah.
Which is this idea that
like a near-term event can foreshadow a much bigger event in the future.
Right. So like you see a hill in the foreground.
Yeah.
And it kind of looks like the shape of a mountain in the background.
I love that analogy.
Yeah. So both are real, but they're happening on different scales and different timelines.
Exactly. But here's the key point.
Yeah.
Even if a prophecy has later fulfillments, those later events should still kind of match the shape of the original.
So like if the original prophecy was about a human birth, then the later fulfillment should also be a human birth.
Absolutely. It should still be within the realm of natural human reproduction.
Okay, so then Isaiah goes on to write a few chapters later. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit.
That's Isaiah 11.1.
Right. And the point that this material makes is that this is clearly talking about the Messiah coming from the lineage of David.
A branch growing from his roots.
Not some divine intervention.
Not something that bypasses the family tree.
Right. So it's like we're back to this question of if other prophecies are so clear about Jesus's Davidic descent, why would the gospel writers reinterpret Isaiah 7 and introduce this whole virgin birth thing?
It's a question.
Like, what was their motivation there?
Especially when you consider the promise that God made to David in 2 Samuel 7.
Oh, right. The promise of an eternal kingdom.
Exactly. God promises David that one of his descendants, someone who will come from his own body, will establish this everlasting kingdom. And the language is so specific.
Yeah, it talks about,
I will set up your seed after you who shall proceed out of your body.
Right, like that's pretty literal.
Super literal. It's all about ancestry and lineage.
And David himself even talks about this everlasting covenant.
Yeah. In 2 Samuel 23.5, he's basically saying, like, yeah, this is a done deal.
Right.
This promise is secure, and it's going to happen.
So when God says, he shall be my son, in this context, the material you sent argues that it's not talking about divine biology.
Right.
It's about divine favor and authority.
Exactly. It's like God is saying, this human descendant of yours, he's going to be my chosen king.
Right, but he's still going to be a human descendant.
Yeah, and a natural part of that family line.
So if the virgin birth bypasses that lineage, the sources are saying that creates a problem.
A big problem.
Because it's like God is breaking his promise.
Right. It's not just about any descendant. It has to be someone who's biologically related to David.
Okay, and then you have all these other prophets who use this imagery of a branch.
Yeah, or Tzemek, growing from the Davidic line.
Yeah, we see that in Jeremiah, Isaiah, again, Ezekiel, Zechariah.
It's like a recurring theme.
And the sources are saying that it's not just a metaphor.
No, it's pointing to a real human king.
Right.
Who's going to come from David's family.
Okay. So we've looked at the traditional view,
yeah,
the biblical accounts, and the discrepancies, and the whole Isaiah prophecy.
What's fascinating is that the sources you sent us then shift gears a little bit, and they start talking about the possibility that the virgin birth might have been a later addition to the Jesus story.
Like it wasn't there from the beginning.
Right. They're arguing that the earliest Christians didn't really focus on the virgin birth.
They focused on what?
On Jesus' baptism.
Yeah.
His being filled with the Spirit.
Okay.
His preaching his miracles.
Yeah.
And his crucifixion and resurrection.
Like those were the core events. And the virgin birth was kind of like
an afterthought.
Yeah, or like it came later.
Right, the theory is that it didn't really become a big deal until Matthew wrote his gospel.
Which was like decades after Jesus.
Yeah, like 70 or 80 AD.
And it's so interesting that Paul, who was writing much earlier, never mentions it.
Never.
It makes you wonder if it was even on his radar.
Right. Yeah. Like what was the original emphasis?
Okay, so why would the virgin birth narrative show up later?
Well, the sources suggest a few possible reasons.
Okay.
First, there were all these rumors going around about Jesus' birth.
Oh, yeah, right? Like some people were saying.
Yeah, some people were saying he was illegitimate or even the son of a Roman soldier.
Right, which would have been like a huge scandal.
Huge.
Yeah.
And then you have to consider the cultural context.
Okay.
In the Roman world, divine births were like a thing.
Right.
Like Caesar Augustus claimed to have a miraculous birth.
Oh, yeah.
And there were all these pagan gods.
Right, like Horus and Mithras.
Exactly, who were said to be born of virgins.
So it was kind of like a trend.
Totally. Oh. So the sources are suggesting that the virgin birth narrative might have been a way to kind of elevate Jesus' status.
Right, like to make him more comparable to these other important figures.
To make him fit in with the cultural expectations.
Yeah, so it's like a theological rebranding.
Exact.
To make him more appealing to a wider audience.
Right. And this is where the discussion gets really interesting to me.
Yeah.
Because it starts to touch on the idea that sometimes theology can be influenced by politics and culture.
Like it's not always pure truth.
Not always.
Okay.
Sometimes it's shaped by the desire to fit in or to gain power.
So in this case, the virgin birth narrative might have been a way
to make Christianity more palatable to the Romans.
Right.
To make it seem less threatening.
Yeah, and more in line with their beliefs.
Exactly.
But then the sources point out a pretty big consequence of this.
Okay.
What's that?
The impact on the Davidic lineage.
Right, because if Jesus wasn't biologically descended from David through Joseph,
then it breaks that chain of ancestry.
Right, which was central to the whole messianic expectation.
Exactly, and the source actually quotes Romans 1.3, where Paul says that Jesus was descended from David according to the flesh.
Right, so Paul is clearly emphasizing Jesus' human lineage here.
Absolutely, and the source then asks this really provocative question.
What's that?
If Jesus wasn't biologically descended from David, did God break his promise?
Wow.
It's a heavy question, right?
Yeah.
And it contrasts this idea of God like teleporting Jesus into the world with the consistent emphasis on inheritance and genealogy.
That we see throughout the Old Testament.
Exactly.
So this leads to a really important point about God's pattern of promise-keeping.
Yeah.
According to these sources, God always fulfills his promises in very specific, tangible, and historical ways.
Yeah, like look at Abraham.
Right? He was promised countless descendants. And that happened.
And the Israelites were delivered from slavery in Egypt.
Right.
God brought them out of exile in Babylon.
Yeah.
And he's preserved the nation of Israel throughout history.
So it's like God works through history.
Yeah, he works through human events.
Right, and he's consistent.
Absolutely.
So the sources are arguing that this pattern is evidence against God creating some kind of loophole in the promise to David.
Like he wouldn't just bypass the normal way of doing things.
Yeah, and this is where the tension comes back in.
Yeah.
Because the genealogies in Matthew and Luke, they trace Jesus' lineage through Joseph all the way back to David.
But the virgin birth narrative contradicts that.
Right. It's like these two ideas can't both be true.
Exactly.
So if we take all of this into account, the sources are encouraging us to rethink the whole idea of the miracle.
Like maybe the real miracle is the way God works through human history.
Through these covenants and promises, not through some kind of supernatural intervention.
Right. They're suggesting that maybe Mary was a woman of faith, chosen for her devotion to God.
Yeah.
But Joseph was actually Jesus's biological father.
So a natural human conception.
Yeah, and they asked this really interesting question.
Yeah.
Would that make the gospel message less powerful? Or would it actually make it more relatable?
More human.
Yeah, like this idea that God can work through ordinary people.
To accomplish extraordinary things.
Exactly, and they end with this really powerful statement.
What's that?
Maybe the real heresy is thinking that Jesus' humanity wasn't enough.
Wow. So it's like a complete reframing of how we understand the incarnation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Instead of God becoming man in some kind of magical way.
Yeah.
It's about a human being born into a specific lineage who lived a life of radical faithfulness and received God's spirit so completely that he showed us all the way back to God.
So just to recap what we've talked about today.
Yeah.
We've looked at the traditional understanding of the virgin birth as a miracle proving Jesus' divinity.
Right.
And we've explored the arguments from your sources that challenge that view.
Absolutely.
We've talked about the different interpretations of prophecy, the importance of Davidic lineage, the possibility of later political and theological influences, and the consistent pattern of God's promise keeping.
It's a lot to think about.
It is, right.
Yeah.
So we've highlighted some key takeaways for you.
Okay.
Like the difference between Alma and Bethulah in Isaiah 7.1 set.
That subtle but important distinction between young woman and virgin.
And the emphasis on Jesus' Davidic descent in all those other prophecies.
Right. And the idea that the virgin birth narrative might have emerged later in the early church. And don't forget about that pattern of God fulfilling his promises through human history.
Yeah, consistently throughout the Old Testament.
Exactly.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on.
Okay.
If the virgin birth might actually be a later interpretation, how does that change how you see Jesus and how you understand God's promises?
That's a big one.
Right.
Yeah.
We really encourage you to keep digging into this stuff.
Absolutely.
Look at the historical context.
The textual details.
Yeah, and come to your own conclusions.
And let us know what you think.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
This is the kind of stuff that keeps us up at night.
Right.
It's so fascinating. It's like a puzzle that we're all trying to solve together.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We hope it's given you some new things to think about.
And some new questions to ask.
Exactly, and maybe even some new answers.
You never know.
All right. Until next time, happy digging.
Keep searching.